If the government can place temptation right in front of you, at what point does choice stop meaning choice and start meaning a trap? Because the whole case turns on one brutal question. Did they expose a criminal or manufacture the crime? And once you hear how these stings actually work, the line between justice and setup gets terrifyingly thin. So let's get into it. They keep saying opportunity, but opportunity with a badge feels different. Like, congratulations, you offered me a crime with a camera on it. And the whole fight is whether that is exposure or setup. That argument gets ugly fast because everybody thinks their version is morality. The cops keep saying nobody is forced, which is technically true. But the other side is saying the crime was planted in front of them. That is the whole philosophical knife fight right there. I love how the room keeps getting dragged back to one sentence. Could you have walked away? Because walking away is easy to say when nobody is starving, broke, or scared. And that is where the former criminal argument hits harder than the legal one. He is basically saying, if the informant never enters, there is no case. Which sounds insane until you realize that is literally how stings work. The law people are saying the government did not create the criminal desire. They just made the desire visible, which is a sneaky sentence if you think about it. We did not make you do it is always the oldest defense in the universe. But the ex-mob guy keeps coming back to the same point. Why manufacture the moment at all? Especially if your target is not some random guy, but somebody already under suspicion. And that is where the cops start sounding more practical than philosophical. They are basically like, we are not inventing a stranger, we are testing a suspect. Which, okay, sounds cleaner until you say it out loud and it still feels dirty. The big tension is whether the informant is just evidence or an active ingredient. Because once the informant is pushing the button, the argument changes. The cops keep saying the button only works if the suspect wants it to, which is a very clean way to describe a very grim profession. The room keeps drifting between law school and a back room in Queens. And honestly, that is why it is fun to listen to. Because nobody is pretending the system is pure. They are arguing about how impure it is allowed to be. Then it jumps to the second big fight. Do cops break rules to catch rule breakers? That is where the whole thing gets spicy, because now everyone is accusing everyone of lying. The former cop says most officers do not want to sabotage their own case. And that sounds reasonable until somebody brings up famous names and political pressure. Big cases always make people act like they are saving civilization. The ex-mob guy keeps saying high-profile targets distort ethics. Because if you get a giant conviction, somebody gets rewarded, promoted, celebrated. And the law enforcement side answers, sure, but that does not mean everybody is cheating. Which is fair because some people are bad is not exactly a shocking revelation. The more interesting part is the culture question. Do institutions quietly tolerate edge casing when the target is famous enough? That is way more interesting than the easy yes or no. Because everybody in that room has a story, and nobody trusts a clean one. Then the red light example shows up, and that was actually useful. A cop can break a traffic rule to save a child, and nobody blinks. But that is because the law itself already gives that exception. Nobody is morally losing sleep over a siren crossing an intersection. The argument is really about covert exceptions, not obvious ones. When does necessity become a permission slip? That is the part they never fully settle. Which is why they keep circling the same examples like they are boxing. Honestly, it does feel like two guys trading body shots with case law. And the personal stories make it way more intense than abstract theory. One side is saying, I lived through being targeted. The other side is saying, I lived inside the system, and it was not that simple. That is why neither side fully lands the knockout. They are both too experienced to sound innocent. And maybe that is the real story. Innocence is not what anybody in that room is selling. They are selling different definitions of fairness. That is much messier and way more real. The undercover question becomes, is the state allowed to tempt people? Because if the answer is yes, then the line is always going to be blurry. And if the answer is no, organized crime gets way harder to penetrate. That is the brutal trade-off nobody can escape. The cops want tools, the critics want guardrails, and both sides think the other side is naive. Which, to be fair, is usually where the best conversations live. I also think the room keeps revealing a trust problem, more than a tactics problem. Like, if you already distrust the institution, every sting looks like a setup. And if you trust the institution, every sting looks like a necessary trap. Same footage, totally different religion. That FBI conversation later really deepens that theme. Because now the issue is not just stings, but whether law enforcement ever bends rules at all. And once that door opens, the room turns into a fight over reputations. One guy says the Bureau is full of people who play by the book. The other says too many cases have smelled political for too long. That is not a disagreement you solve in one sentence, obviously. Especially when both men are absolutely committed to their own memories. And honestly, memory is the loudest witness in the room. Sometimes it is also the least obedient one. What really stands out is how often they separate principle from practice. In principle, everyone wants honest policing. In practice, they keep arguing about pressure, ambition, and shortcuts, which is basically every powerful institution ever. Then the conversation shifts towards safer streets versus arrest counts, and that is a great pivot. One officer says the job is danger first, not stats first. The other says high-profile arrests still shape careers more than people admit, which probably depends on who is making the arrest and who is watching. But the DWI officer's point is important. Some cops are literally focused on stopping harm in real time. That does not fit neatly into the cynical version of policing. Still, the ex-criminal is not talking about that world. He is talking about organized crime, where the goal is often to catch somebody after the fact. And that difference matters a lot. Because a drunk driver and a mob boss are not the same operating manual. Not even close. The funniest part is how often they almost agree without noticing. Like everyone seems to agree bad cops exist. Nobody serious is saying every agent is a saint. The real split is whether bad behavior is exceptional or systemic. That is the core of the whole episode, honestly. Not whether crime exists, but how much the system invites it into the room. And next episode, I want to hear them go even harder on the line between evidence and provocation. Because right now they are not done being mad at each other yet. Which is exactly why you keep listening. That conversation is only getting messier from here. Episode 2 is where the trust fractures get even louder. Oh, this is where it gets spicy, because free will is doing a lot of heavy lifting here. Every cop in the room is basically saying, he could have just said no. And the other guy is like, no, you brought the whole crime to my doorstep. That argument sounds simple, but it is actually brutal when you unpack it. Because the real fight is not whether the person had a choice. It's whether the government should be allowed to create the exact temptation it later prosecutes. And that is where everyone starts talking past each other like professionals. One side hears ethics, the other side hears excuses. The ex-cop and ex-mafia guy are basically saying the same thing with different scars. They both believe the system can bend until it looks normal. And then the cops come in like, hold on, that's not what this is. Which is fair because they are not out here making crimes out of thin air every day. But the question is whether some cases are still being built by pressure, not discovery. That's the uncomfortable part nobody wants to sit with too long. Because if the target is already criminal, then everybody relaxes instantly. But if the target is broke and weak and lonely, suddenly the room gets weird. That was the whole jewelry store example, and that example hits because it feels dirty. Like, sure, the guy said yes, but did he have to be handed the whole setup? The law enforcement answer is still yes, because he still chose. Which is such a cop answer that you almost respect the consistency. It's basically moral geometry. If you can walk away, the state wins. And if you do walk away, the defense says there was never a crime at all. So both sides are using the same exit ramp as proof of their point. That is why the whole conversation feels like a trap inside a trap. Then they pivot into John Gotti, because of course they do. You cannot have a mafia conversation without somebody invoking a name like it is a spell. And the point there is not really Gotti, it's the scale of the operation. The cops are saying, we already have smoke, we just need fire. The critics are saying, no, you brought a flamethrower into a dry room. Same sentence, different conviction level. That is what makes undercover work so slippery as a concept. It can look like investigation and manufacturing at the same time. Sometimes the same act becomes either heroism or corruption, depending on the witness. And then the whole room starts arguing about informants like they are magic objects. If the CI came in, then the crime was born. If the suspect said yes, then the crime was his own. Both of those can sound true in the same 5 minutes. That's the maddening part, because neither side is totally insane, which is always the best possible podcast outcome, honestly. The other giant fight is whether law enforcement itself cuts corners. And that one gets personal fast, because now it's about integrity, not tactics. Nobody enjoys being told their whole profession might be a little sloppy, especially not from a former criminal sitting across from them. But the ex-cop's point is actually not crazy. Big cases take years and layers. The idea that every sting is some random dude with a wire is just silly. Usually there is already a pattern, already a target, already some reason to look. So the real disagreement is not about whether evidence exists. It's about how much pressure is acceptable before evidence turns into bait. And then they move into the FBI argument, and suddenly the temperature jumps again. Because now we are not just talking stings, we are talking institutional trust. One guy is saying, most agents are honest, but some absolutely stretch it. The other guy is saying, that description is way too broad and way too cynical. And the funniest part is they both kind of need each other to be partly right. Because if nobody ever abused power, the critic has no case. And if abuse is treated as normal, the defender has no credibility. That is the nightmare of every institution with a badge and a press release. The funny tension is that the cops keep saying, we don't want to ruin good cases. And the ex-mafia guy keeps saying, then stop building cases with dirty hands. Which sounds dramatic, but also, if you've lived that life, maybe not dramatic enough. There is a weird honesty in people who admit the system worked on them and against them. They are not pretending the world is clean, just arguing about where the dirt starts. And nobody in that room is giving the other side an easy inch. That is why the red light example lands so hard later. Because it forces everyone to separate legal permission from moral discomfort. Yes, a cop can run the light for an emergency, but that is not the same as a sting. One is a legal exception, the other is a philosophical headache. And that distinction matters a lot more than people think. Because once you blur those together, everybody starts acting like anything goes. The ex-cop keeps pulling it back to rules, limits, and whether the tactic is legitimate. The critics keep pulling it back to intent, pressure, and who actually planted the idea. And the whole time everybody is basically saying, you are missing the obvious part. Which is the most podcast thing imaginable. But honestly, that's what makes it good, because the disagreement never gets lazy. They are arguing the principle, but every example is personal and messy. That's why the Safer Streets claim matters too, because it shifts the metric. One side is saying success is arrests and convictions. The other side is saying success is whether people are actually safer. And those are not always the same thing, not even close. Arrest counts look great until the neighborhood still feels like a mess. But from the cops' perspective, taking a drunk driver off the road is real prevention. So the disagreement is really about where policing is reactive and where it becomes performative. And that is a much more dangerous question than people expect. Because once you ask it out loud, everyone suddenly has a long memory. And a short fuse. All right, let's breathe for a second, because episode 2 is where they stop dancing around the trust issue. The next round gets even sharper on who gets targeted, who gets protected, and who gets believed. And that is where the whole thing starts feeling less theoretical and way more personal. Wait, because this is where people start acting like a sting is just a camera with a badge. But if the crime needs a planted person, is that exposure or invention? That line is doing a lot of work right now. The wild part is both sides keep saying free will like it solves everything. Like, sure, he can walk away, but why is the crime on the table at all? That's the whole moral grenade, honestly. If law enforcement introduces the setup, how clean is the choice, really? And if the target bites, everyone suddenly calls it proof of intent. Which is such a neat little trick when you say it fast enough. But the cop argument is always, we didn't force anyone. Okay, but did they create the moment where the person could fall? That's not a tiny distinction, that's the whole case. The room keeps pretending it's a philosophy seminar, but it is actually power. Because once you have the power to bait, you also have the power to frame the menu. And that menu is never equally offered to everybody, is it? That's where the distrust starts bleeding in. The former mafia guy keeps saying, you brought the crime to me. And the cops keep saying, you still chose it. It's the same sentence wearing different uniforms. But the real tension is whether opportunity is already guilt. Because law enforcement loves to say, good people walk away. And the other side says, fine, but you shouldn't manufacture the walkaway test. That is such a brutal sentence, by the way. Then the conversation shifts to informants, which is where it gets extra messy. Because now it's not just an undercover cop, it's a criminal helping build the case. And that feels a lot less like observation and a lot more like engineering. Especially when the informant already has leverage or a deal hanging over them. So are they a witness, a tool, or a spark? Usually all three, which is a terrifying job description. The cop side keeps insisting there are controls, approvals, and oversight. Which sounds good until you ask who is policing the police in the room. Then suddenly everybody gets very interested in procedure. The former cop keeps saying he's seen people framed, not just arrested. And that's where this stops being abstract and starts sounding personal. Because once somebody says they almost bit on a trap, you listen differently. But the FBI guys keep coming back to one thing: no one is forced. And the response is always, you don't need force if you manufacture pressure. That is the entire argument in one sentence, basically. I also think they keep talking past each other on what counts as crime. One side means the act itself, the other means the setup around the act. Which is how you get two adults fighting over the word manufacture like it's a weapon. And then the conversation pivots to the bigger accusation: law enforcement breaking laws to catch lawbreakers. That is the one people really lean in for. Because once you say that out loud, everybody starts naming examples. Suppressed evidence, perjury, pressure, bad warrants, all of it. And then the FBI veteran comes in saying the culture was rules, approvals, and documentation. Which is believable, but it doesn't erase the horror stories. That's the real conflict: institutions versus individual abuse. And people keep trying to solve it with one sentence, which is never happening. The political detour was inevitable, by the way. Once somebody says James Comey, the room is no longer about undercover work. Now it's about whether the public trust in federal agencies has completely collapsed. And whether that collapse is earned or manufactured depends on who is talking. Which is exactly why this topic is so combustible. I actually liked the red light example, even though everyone tried to swat it away. Because there is a difference between breaking a rule for rescue and baiting someone into a felony. One is emergency discretion, the other is setting a trap and calling it strategy. That distinction matters unless you are trying very hard to not let it matter. And then the cops push back hard on the idea that they do this for promotions. Some of them are genuinely talking about public safety, not vanity. The DWI officer was actually a great counterpoint because that is real street-level prevention. You are not inventing drunk driving, you are stopping it in motion. But the former cop keeps separating that from stings that create an offense window. And honestly, that split is hard to dismiss. Because arresting a guy who is actively swerving is not the same as inviting a guy to swerve. That's a very ugly sentence, but it is kind of the point. The disagreement is really about whether policing should react to crime or nudge it into existence. And once you frame it that way, nobody sounds innocent anymore. Because even the good faith arguments start sounding a little self-serving. That's why the trust question keeps hanging over everything. Not just can police catch criminals, but can they do it without becoming something else? And that question is exactly where episode 2 gets nastier. Because then they stop arguing theory and start arguing who the system really protects. That is where the gloves come off. All right, let's leave it there before somebody throws a chair at procedure. Episode 2 is where the trust issue goes fully from abstract to personal. And the next round gets even sharper on who gets targeted, who gets protected, and who gets believed. That trust gap is really the whole fight, isn't it? One side hears investigation, the other side hears bait. And nobody is relaxing about it, which is kind of the point. Because the word opportunity sounds clean until somebody gets burned. That's what I keep hearing underneath everything. Is the government exposing intent or building the hallway to the crime? And then everyone acts shocked when the hallway has cameras. The funniest part is they all agree criminals have free will. They just can't agree on who designed the moment of choice. That's not a tiny disagreement, that's the whole case. If a CI walks in and plants the idea, is that still neutral? Or does the state cross a line the second it starts narrating the crime? Everybody in that room is arguing over one slippery word. Manufacture is doing a lot of heavy lifting. And the cops keep saying, "We didn't force anyone." Which is true, but maybe not the whole truth. Because free will does not automatically equal fair play. That's the part people dodge while they keep doing the arm-waving thing. They keep coming back to the same fork, chance versus creation. And honestly, that's where it gets interesting. A sting sounds modest until you realize it has a whole production crew. Audio, video, supervisors, warrants, paperwork, the whole circus. So when someone says, "We just set up an opportunity," that lands differently. Because an opportunity can be a trap if the target was never moving there. But of course, the response is always, "Then say no," which is a very elegant thing to say after the fact. In the moment, the whole pressure point is whether the person was already leaning that way. And nobody wants to admit how much leaning counts as predisposition. That's why the Mafia example matters so much. The names are huge, but the logic stays the same. Put a famous boss in the room and suddenly everyone's a philosopher. John Gotti could make a traffic stop sound like constitutional law. But the underlying argument is still basic. Did the state find crime or invite it? And if the invitation is aggressive enough, does it stop being legitimate? That's where the former criminal keeps pushing hardest. He's basically saying, "You wouldn't have had this crime without your guy." Which is a wild line, but not a dumb one. Because if the CI brings the first criminal move, what exactly was exposed? Maybe intent, maybe weakness, maybe greed. Or maybe just the ability to get people talking. And honestly, talking is where half the trouble starts. The law enforcement side keeps coming back to control. Controls, approvals, judges, documented steps, all that. Basically, we didn't freestyle this felony. And that's a real distinction because not every sting is some rogue hallway ambush. Still, the emotional objection doesn't go away just because the paperwork is thick. That tension is why the red light example even comes up. Officers can technically break a traffic law in an emergency and nobody freaks out. Because if your daughter is in the car, the rule book gets very quiet. But that doesn't automatically bless every stretch of authority. That's the trap in the argument. One exception becomes a permission slip. And the former cop keeps separating lawful discretion from manufactured crime. He basically says, if there's already criminal activity, fine. Which is the most sensible sentence in the whole argument. Because nobody is upset when police catch somebody actually selling drugs. The fight starts when the state seems to feed the beast and then arrest it. That is what makes people suspicious of the whole machine. Especially when the room keeps circling back to big names and big headlines. The other side is saying big targets justify big effort because the harm is bigger. That's a persuasive point, honestly. If one person is moving hundreds of victims, the incentive to build a case is obvious. But then you still have to ask whether the case is cleaner because it's bigger. Bigger crime does not magically create cleaner ethics. If anything, it creates more temptation to bend things. And that's where the second debate starts sneaking in. Not just whether stings create crime, but whether the people running them stay clean. Because once you trust the institution less, every technique looks dirtier. The ex-mob guy keeps saying some agents absolutely crossed lines. Perjury, buried evidence, pressure tactics, all of it. And the response is basically, sure, humans are flawed, but calm down. Which is fair and annoying at the same time. That's the energy of the whole episode, honestly. Everybody is half right and completely intolerable about it. Because one side sees institutional abuse and the other sees necessary policing. And both sides are reacting to real stuff, not fantasy. That's what makes the whole thing messy instead of simple. The cops are not saying we are perfect. They're saying, don't pretend the job is morally identical to the crime. Which, fair, that is a strong line. But the counter is stronger than people admit. How far can you push before it becomes baiting? And that is why nobody leaves that table satisfied. They all walk away thinking the other side is impossible. Yet the arguments actually reveal the same fear from both sides. One side fears criminals slipping away. The other fears police becoming too creative. That's the real structural conflict. Catching bad people is easy to defend until the methods get ugly. And once the method gets ugly, every conviction starts looking like a moral tax. So the episode isn't really about one sting. It's about whether power can investigate power without inventing its own shortcuts. That is the sentence everybody keeps trying to outrun. And nobody outruns it for long. Because the second you trust the process less, every win feels suspicious. Which is why episode 2 gets nastier fast. That next argument is where the trust issue stops being abstract and starts sounding personal in about 3 seconds. All right, let's leave this one before procedure becomes a knife fight. Episode 2 is where the targeting debate gets sharper and the excuses get thinner. And that's when the whole room really stops pretending this is simple